Hey guys, welcome back to our walkthrough of classic poetry. Today I want to introduce one of my favorite forms of poetry, which is the sonnet. And I want to do so by going over one of the sonnets of Edna St. Vincent Millay, who incidentally wrote my favorite poem of all time, the poem Recuerdo. And I've done another walkthrough on that poem, so if you haven't watched that one yet, I highly encourage it because it's just a beautiful poem. But back to sonnets. What makes a sonnet a sonnet? Well, it's actually a very difficult form of poetry to compose, and the reason why is because sonnets are generally considered always and only to have 14 lines. But not only that, within those 14 lines, they're generally always broken up into two parts. The introduction, which is the first 8 lines, and the conclusion, which are the last 6 lines. So you can see it would be quite an undertaking and very constraining to compose a poem that you know has to be exactly and only 14 lines long and has to be broken up into 2 specific parts. So it begs the question, why would a poet ever subject themselves to that? I mean, the last thing you want when you have inspiration to write a poem is to be forced into a rigid box, and know it has to be done a very specific way. It seems like it would squash your inspiration almost immediately. So there has to be some advantage. And while that's up for some debate and speculation, the sonnet seems to do something very interesting to the subconscious mind. While the conscious mind is reading the poem, trying to understand the actual meaning of the poem, the subconscious mind is in the background searching for patterns and structure. And there's plenty of that to be had within the sonnet. And what seems to happen is that when the reader transitions from the introduction to the conclusion of the poem, the reader has read the first 8 lines and has seen that they're very structured and they're a self-contained little rhyme scheme. The subconscious mind is expecting symmetry. So it's expecting another 8 lines with its own self-contained rhyme scheme. But what it gets is 6 lines. And what that appears to do to the subconscious mind is to generate that really pleasant feeling of wishing there was a little bit more. It kind of tricks the subconscious mind by making it think that there will be 8 lines when in fact there's only 6. So it leaves that reader with the feeling that they've just read something really profound, that the poet was able to cram a lot of meaning into a short space. And so a lot of poets have written great sonnets over the years, most notably William Shakespeare, who wrote hundreds of them, but you don't see a whole lot of them being composed in the modern age, which is kind of sad because it's a beautiful art form. But my favorite sonnets were written by the poet Edna St. Vincent Millay, and I've selected one of hers to introduce this art form of sonnets with. It's called Time Does Not Bring Relief. So as always, it's written down below so you can follow along as I read aloud. Time does not bring relief. You all have lied, who told me time would ease me of my pain. I miss him in the weeping of the rain. I want him at the shrinking of the tide. The old snows melt from every mountainside, and last year's leaves are smoke in every lane. But last year's bitter loving must remain heaped on my heart, and my old thoughts abide. There are 100 places where I fear to go, so with his memory they brim. And entering with relief some quiet place, where never fell his foot or shone his face, I say there is no memory of him here, and so stand stricken, so remembering him. Now, even though that's a sad and tragic poem, it's just a really beautiful example of someone going through, that struggle of heartache that we all get struck with at different intervals of our lives. And I love the way she starts off this poem, the biting and feisty line of time does not bring relief, you all have lied. We get the sense that probably her friends and family in a very well-meaning fashion came around her to try and support her after a lost love. They saw her suffering and wanted to help, and they said, things like, well, cheer up, sweetie, you're gonna get over this, you'll bounce back. I mean, time heals all wounds, right? And probably horrified, she looked at them and said, you think that's how it works? Well, it doesn't. And guess what? Now I'm gonna write a poem about it. And so now we have this beautiful sonnet that she composed based on this advice that she didn't want to take, probably from her friends and family. So what exactly is going on in this poem? There's a couple subtleties that you might have missed out on. This poem was composed in the spring, and we know that because she said things like, the old snows melt from every mountainside, which is something that happens during spring. And so what appears to be happening in this poem is that springtime is back to the world. You know, spring is in the air. The world is reviving with new life, and the poet is struck by the fact that she still is clinging to this old love from the year before. She says last year's leaves are smoke in every lane, but last year's bitter loving must remain heaped on my heart. And it's an interesting word picture, because to say that last year's leaves are smoke means that they've all been burned up. And the picture that we get in the fall is everyone gathering around and raking up their leaves into a heap, and then in the olden days they would burn them. They would turn them into smoke. But she says last year's bitter loving has remained, and it's heaped on her heart. And she uses that same word picture of the bitter loving being heaped, just like the leaves of last fall were heaped, but subsequently turned into smoke. And so even though the entire world has started to revive and has started to awaken with the spring and new life, she's struck by the fact that, wow, she's still holding on to last year's bitter loving. And so she transitions to a new idea, right? The spring is here, there's new life in the air, why not try something new herself, right? So she says there's 100 places that she fears to go because they're so full of his memory. So she gets this idea, well, why don't I go to a new place, right? Somewhere where never fell his foot or shone his face. And in the tragic final lines of the poem, she says, there's no memory of him here, right? I found a new spot. And then realizes that she still stands stricken, so remembering him, because we carry our pain with us. And she's struck by the notion of, you know, I can't just go to a new place and expect things to be different, you know, because we carry our pain with us. So I hope you enjoyed this sonnet. It's just a really beautiful sonnet. It's a beautiful description of someone that is going through the tragedy of heartbreak and loss. And I hope you'll read it a number of times to get the full meaning. There's more in this poem that we didn't discuss, and you can see exactly what it is that makes a sonnet, the structure of them, because we're going to go through more sonnets in this walkthrough. They're really a beautiful form of poetry once you understand exactly what they're doing. So I look forward to seeing you on the next walkthrough.